Dr. Bridges current academic interests are philosophical theology of Thomas Aquinas, the philosophy of science and the issues in philosophy of religion. In other words, the problem of evil. He just recently finished his PhD in October 2012 by successfully defending his doctoral dissertation titled An Analysis of the New Darwin Intelligent Design Debate Based on an Eclectic Philosophy of Science Grounded in the Thomistic Realism, which is very clever. As long as he knows what it is, we're safe, and I know he knows what it is. His committee of readers included SES Professor of Philosophy Richard G. Howe, SES Professor, ID Scholar and Mathematician William A. Dembski, University of Oxford Professor and Mathematician John C. Lennox, and Discovery Institute Senior Fellow and Philosopher J.W. Riches. All that just basically says is he knows what he's talking about. And we can honor him for that and also for the gift that is on his life. So just want you to put your hands together and then we're going to welcome him.
Sibilance. Thanks, Don. Well, I don't really need to know all that stuff. You guys just need to not know it, and then I can just say whatever I want. Well, as I understood tonight's talk or discussion, since you guys will be asking questions at the end, right? You'll be listening critically, taking notes, and asking questions, right? That's assumed. Since following Ray's lead, since he sort of fleshed his bio out a little bit, I'll do the same to kind of lead into the talk. I do have an interest in the philosophy of science, but as I've begun telling my philosophy students, I see myself more interested in Christian apologetics than anything else. And I'm interested in Christian apologetics because basically the goal of Christian apologetics is to remove intellectual obstacles from those people who don't know Jesus so that they can know Jesus, right? So apologetics is a handmaiden, as it were, to evangelism, and evangelism has as its purpose to bring people into an introduction with Jesus, right? And in doing that, just like when the corporate body of the church gets together and worships, they're doing something that's eternally significant, right? Because the church will be together forever in the presence of God, worshiping God. That's our eternal end. And so when we get together, how often we do that, that has an eternal referent. It has an eternal analog. I'm trying to use other words here. And so evangelism is something similar. In introducing people to Jesus, we are focused on the immortal soul that is the other person. Now we get hung up in your culture, we get hung up in my culture over where people live and their skin color and the type of clothes they wear and the way they talk. And we tend to lose sight of, because there is a very real way in which we enter into human personality conflicts and territory disputes and sports fanaticism. I've heard a lot about this rugby team is better than that rugby team. And it's sort of refreshing to be in a place where I know nothing about rugby and can be somewhat a part of those debates. I should say apart from those debates. And so keeping in mind that the task of apologetics is to help evangelism, well, in my mind, there's a task that goes prior to apologetics, and that is, for me at least, the study of philosophy, and in particular, my interest in the philosophy of science. The reason I was interested in the philosophy of science is so that I could get to understand why is it that Darwinism becomes such a problem for people. And to understand Darwinism, you've got to, at least in part, get into the mind of the scientists who are convinced by the evidence. And so what we're going to do a little bit tonight is I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on Darwin's original project in his Origin of a Species from 1859. I'm going to walk you through very quickly some of the developments in the 20th century that led to neo-Darwinism and how that differs maybe a little bit from the original Darwinism. And then I'll talk about the 5 or 6 lines of evidence that Darwinists usually point to as evidence for their own claims. I'll give you a little bit about how Darwinists critique creationism, and then we'll go through each of those lines of evidence to see how strongly it is supported by the evidence. Okay. So the first part is the historical influences on Charles Darwin himself, because ideas always come from somewhere. They're not just picked out of thin air. And so Darwin, Charles Darwin, in publishing his work in 1859, he had people that influenced him. One of those people, his name is T.R. Malthus, Thomas Robert Malthus, and in 1798 he published a book called An Essay on the Principles of Population. And what Malthus reasoned was this: because the resources in our environment only grow what he called arithmetically, that is, 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and because populations tend to grow geometrically, the population growth will always exceed and then be limited by the sustaining ability of the environment, right? And Malthus believed this because he was combating an idea that human civilization will always be growing towards some sort of utopia. That was a common idea there. And Malthus, looking at the way sustenance and population growth relate to one another, said, no, that can't be the case. And so you can see how an idea like this might have influenced Charles Darwin in saying the environment has an effect on a population. Okay? Somebody else who was crucially influential on Charles Darwin was a guy named Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell was a geologist, and in the 1830s he published a 3-volume set called On the Principles of Geology. Books didn't have real fancy titles back then. They just told you what they were actually about, which is nice. So Charles Lyell, in his 3-volume set on the principles of geology, he sets out a description of geological features. So, for example, a canyon. Before Charles Lyell, everybody had sort of a biblical view of the flood, this ancient catastrophe that was the explanation for why the land masses look the way they do. Well, Charles Lyell, and everybody had a sort of a recent version of creationism. We'll just call them young earth creationists. They all thought that this happened about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Well, Charles Lyell in the 1830s publishes his volumes on the principles of geology, and he says that's not the case. The earth is not 6,000 to 10,000 years old. It's probably around 300 million years old. And what we see need not be accounted for by large catastrophic changes, but small changes over geologic time can lead to large changes. So, for example, if you think of a river running through a river valley, he says, well, there's a minuscule amount of erosion that happens every year. And if that river runs through that river valley for 30 or 40 or 70 million years, now you have a canyon. So canyons don't need to develop out of some catastrophic event, but small changes over time can lead to large changes. This does 2 things for Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory. The first thing it does is it opens up what we might call a conceptual space, because Darwin, in his Origin of Species, says, if you're not convinced by Charles Lyell's view of geology, then my position really doesn't have a leg to stand on, right? Because unless you have a long period of geologic time, then you can't get the second element, which is small changes adding up to very large changes. And that's the other thing that Darwin adopts from Charles Lyell, is he says, not regarding geological features, but regarding biological features, small changes over geologic time can add up to large changes. Okay? The third influence on Charles Darwin, and it may sound weird to call this an influence, is William Paley's book, Natural Theology, which is actually the book that Darwin's Origin of the Species was meant to overthrow, and actually did in the culture supplant. In 1804, William Paley's Natural Theology had gone through multiple editions. It was used as the textbook in America and on the European continent in universities. And Charles Darwin, when he originally went to the university, went to study theology. And from his private papers, correspondence that he wrote to a friend on the day that his book, The Origin of Species, was published in 1859, he said to his friend about William Paley's natural theology that he had read it and read it and reread it such that he could have quoted it from memory. And so this is interesting because if you read William Paley's natural theology, he says certain things. He says he affirms a recent special creation of species. Right? So this is in contradistinction to Lyell's long time spans. He affirms a recent special creation of fixed species in their environment. Okay? Something else that William Paley argues is from the complexity of the human eye, we can know necessarily that God has designed us. And he makes the argument like this. In his day, the most sophisticated piece of scientific equipment was the telescope. And he says, look at the telescope. The human eye has more ability to change and focus and retract than even the telescope does, yet we think the telescope was created by man. Then, of course, necessarily, the human eye, which is more complex, had to have been created as well. Okay? I say all those things to lead you into Charles Darwin's original project. Okay? So, Charles Darwin has Paley in mind. He's read Paley so much that he could have quoted him by heart. And so, if you read The Origin of the Species and don't fall asleep, because it's extremely boring, but I did it out of necessity, you will see that what Darwin argues for is not a recent creation event, but for a long duration for the earth. He says he's convinced by Charles Lyell's view of geology, and that if you don't have Charles Lyell's view of geology, then he really doesn't have a position. So he replaces William Paley's view of a recent creation with a long, long time span, at least long for them, which was at 300 million years. He proves, and I emphasize this, he proves in his work that animals are not specifically created for their environment, but can adapt to it, right? Now, we don't really have a problem with that with our Christianity, but imagine in 1859, William Paley published his natural theology in 1804. So for 55 years, William Paley's view of biology and species in its relationship to Christianity had dominated in the universities in America and in Europe. Okay? So Darwin coming along and actually giving evidence for the mutability of species, that the fact that they weren't created specifically for their environment. And he does this. And some people don't understand the Galapagos Islands and how that functions in Darwin's original origin. What he said is this. The Galapagos Islands are off the coast of South America, right? The Cape de Verde Islands are off the coast of Africa, right? The Galapagos Islands and the Cape de Verde Islands have an extremely similar climate, extremely similar environments. And yet, Darwin says, we see completely different plants and animals on these two islands. The plants and animals that we find on these islands with remarkable similar climates are actually closely related to the mainland that they're closest to. He says this tells us that God doesn't create animals necessarily, specifically for some environment, but that animals migrate. That they migrate from their mainland to the closest islands, right? He goes further and says, because there are some islands where when, say, a frog is introduced into that environment, the frog flourishes and actually becomes a pest. So if a frog can flourish in that sort of environment, why didn't God create frogs there? So this is a problem for William Paley's interpretation of species, and Darwin actually travels around the world and finds evidence for his position. So that shook people who had William Paley's view of species. The other thing he says is that Charles Darwin in England was a pigeon breeder. He belonged to a pigeon society, and he kept and bred generation after generation of pigeons. The one thing that he noticed is that just like other breeders, sheep and cattle and dogs, if you select the mates and you pick mating couples, you can actually select for one trait in a population, in a finite population. You can select a trait that you want, perhaps darker feathers or some streaking in the plumage, right? And generation after generation, you do this, you get a full population that all has that trait. So you've bred a trait into, you can breed a trait into or out of a population. Well, what does William Paley say? He says that God has created fixed species in their environment. Darwin has shown that these animals are not necessarily created in that environment. Now he shows that species are, to some degree, mutable. They can be changed. He says breeders have known this all along. But perhaps instead of an artificial or intelligent selection, there's something that nature does, some sort of natural selection that goes on such that traits are bred into or out of a population because they make an animal either more well adapted to its environment. And again, this doesn't really sound crazy to us because we already see that, yeah, that's right, we know that animals are mutable. But for somebody who thinks that animals have to be a fixed species in order to believe in a creator God, Darwin comes along and says, no, here's all this great evidence from my own work and other people's work that species are actually, to some degree, malleable. They're mutable. They can be changed. So somebody who thinks that fixed species necessitates design, Darwin says they're not fixed. So their faith that God is a creator gets shaken. And then finally, we said that William Paley argued that because of the complex interconnectivity, the interconnections in the human eye, that God necessarily had to have designed it. Now, we are not going to in any way get into the intricacies of what we call modal logic. But suffice it to say this, modal terms are terms of possibility and necessity, contingency, things like that. So when William Paley makes the argument that because of the interconnectivity of the human eye, God necessarily had to have designed, the only thing you need to prove that that argument is false is to show that it's possible that the complexity of the eye came about without design. You don't have to prove that it's true that the human eye wasn't designed. All you have to show that it's possible that it wasn't designed, and the argument that it's necessarily designed fails. Okay, this is just the logic of the two arguments. Knowing that Charles Darwin is highly influenced by William Paley, now we see the argument that he makes in The Origin much more clearly. William Paley said that because of the connectivity of the human eye, God necessarily designed. Now we look at The Origin of Species, and what does Darwin say? He says, he doesn't give evidence like with the Galapagos Islands and the Cape de Verde Islands. He doesn't give evidence like the mutability of species, which is actual evidence. He does a thought experiment. He says, let's say that a human skin cell or a skin cell develops by chance some sensitivity to light, some bare sensitivity to light. And then over time, that area around that cell becomes, what he says, invaginated. It just becomes concave in some way. And then over further time, it develops more sensitivity and more sensitivity. He says, given an amount of geologic time, it's possible that even the eye of the eagle could have been brought about by natural causes alone. Now, has he given us any real, hard, empirical evidence? No. But he has given us at least a thought experiment to show that it's possible that a complex eye could have come about by natural causes alone. And because William Paley set up such a strong position, all Darwin needs to show is that it's possible in order to overthrow Paley's very strong modal conclusion. Okay. Hopefully with these historical influences in place and a little bit of an understanding of the structure of Darwin's original project, you can see why when this comes on the scene after 55 years of William Paley's natural theology, it sweeps through America and Europe almost without criticism. There are these ideas already in place from Malthus and Lyell, and they sort of pave the way for this paradigm shift, this scientific paradigm shift, this overthrow from Darwin to Paley. Okay, now one of the things that Darwin was not aware of is the science of genetics. What he said in his Origin was just that natural selection was working on variations among individuals in order to change populations in some way. Well, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the science of genetics was born. And by whatever means, scientists began to understand that there are features inside the nucleus of a cell that are responsible for the traits of an organism. And so in the 1940s, you have what's called the Great Synthesis. You have thinkers like Theodosius Dobzhansky, Ernst Mayr, and Gould. It's not Stephen Jay Gould, it's another Gould. And also Aldous Huxley. Yeah, Stephen Jay Gould would go to Harvard later in the 60s. He would have been a very, very old Gould. Anyway. And so what happens in the Great Synthesis is Darwin seems like he's predicted something actually crucial, that there's variations in individuals, and then natural selection works on that to create a more complex organism or to adapt an organism better to its environment. Now in genetics, these men who were saturated with a belief in Darwinism, they say, aha. They actually say, aha. The variations that Darwin is talking about could be the random mutations that we find in the genetic code that pop up occasionally. If some of these, out of the millions that happen, if some of these in an individual were efficacious, that is, they made the individual better for their environment, then that individual would breed better, would feed better, would migrate better, whatever that organism does, and then that trait would be bred into the population, right? Because every offspring of that animal would have this trait and would be better than its competitors, right? Remember, Malthus said that as populations grow, the competition for the sustenance is going to grow, and that limits the population. Well, Darwin's going to use that and say, yes, that's true, and it's the better competitor that wins the better sustenance, and so his trait, or its trait, goes through the population, okay? And this synthesis with Darwin's original work and genetics is what we call neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism is a more complex version of Darwin's original work. Okay. So that brings us up to today, with a lot of gaps. That brings us up to today. So we're going to get into just, I think, 6 lines of evidence that Darwinists usually use to support the viability or the truth of this theory. The first is genetic similarities. And genetic similarities can be broken up into 2 separate categories. The first is this, that there are similarities among species that we think have a common ancestor. The one that is top of mind is that humans and chimpanzees share, whoever you're reading, 90 or 95% of their genetic coding. This is evidence that Darwin was right, that humans and chimpanzees come from an earlier common ancestor, right? The other argument from genetic similarities is this: every animal that is living, the way in which they're let's see, trying to think of how much to unpack for you. The way in which DNA codes for amino acids is that DNA has what's called a codon, which is 3 pieces of DNA all in a row. A, T, G, and C, those are the 4 ribonucleic acids. And in triplicate, they are a codon. And each codon codes for a specific amino acid. And you need amino acids to do all kinds of things, namely build proteins. And proteins are used to build things like enzymes and antibodies and cell membranes, things like that. So you need proteins, and in turn you need these amino acids. Well, the other argument is this: the coding that we see throughout life is always the same, with some minor variations. The same codon in mice And the same codon in humans codes for, say, isoleucine or leucine or one of the amino acids, right? And so that is an argument that we all share a common ancestor. No matter how far back we go, the reason all life shares this common coding element, or the reason it codes for the same amino acids, is because we come from the same origin, right? So those are the two aspects of the first line of evidence, genetic similarities. Morphological similarities. Morpho just means form, right? There are forms that are similar across animal species. So the one that I'm most aware of is called the pentadactyl forelimb. And the pentadactyl forelimb just means that if you look at a human forelimb, the fin of a whale, the wing of a bat, and I think it's probably the shank of a cow, they all have, with some slight variation, the same pentadactyl 5-pronged form, right? And so this morphological similarity is an indication that all of these diverse species have, at some point in history, natural history, an underlying common ancestor, which again supports the Darwinian story, the narrative. 3, embryological development. Now, for a long time in evolutionary biology, there was a mantra that says ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, right? What that means is that in embryological development, as things grow from embryos into their adult forms, if we isolate each of those stages of embryonic development, we can see the similar evolutionary pathways of these different species. And the species are diverse, but their embryological pathways parallel one another. And so this again shows us that there's some common ancestor, or there's some common origin of all of us. Okay, actually, I already did. I put genetic coding in as a separate one, and then I lumped it under 2. So actually we have 5 lines of evidence. Okay, the fossil record. The fossil record, at least in general, shows from about 3.5 billion years ago all the way up to the present day, it shows an increasing complexity from microbes to smaller complex animals to fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, simpler mammals to more complex mammals, all the way up to pre-hominids, hominids, and then humans. So Darwin exactly predicted this. He predicted that things would go from simpler to more complex, and that in general is the trend that we see in the fossil record. So again, Darwinism is correct. And then finally, evidence from microevolutionary biology. Microevolutionary biology is the thing that they're pointing to when they point to small changes in species that adapt them to their environment. So the finch beaks on the Galapagos Islands. Finch beaks, because of environmental changes, will change, right? And so they can even go from smaller to larger, right? The average size of the beak has changed purely because of the environmental changes. And so it's only the large-beaked finches that will survive, and the small ones will die out, right? Antibiotics. So bacteria, if you use the same antibiotic over and over and over again on a population of bacteria, it will develop, some percentage of that bacteria will develop a resistance to that antibody, right? And then that percentage is the percentage that's going to survive. And so over time, what you have is a population of the old bacteria with some slight modification to survive its now harsh environment. And this is a wonderful picture of what Darwin is talking about. And so again, we see that the Darwinian idea plays itself out. Okay? These are typically the lines of evidence for Darwinism. Now we'll talk about 3 pieces of evidence from what we might call dysteleology. Teleology is the idea that something is moving toward an end or is created for an end. Dysteleology is when there's something wrong with the design. So the debate between Mac users and PC users. You know, the Mac user is going to say there's some dysteleology in IBM computers, right? Yes, Pastor Rudolph says yes. So we think that there's some flaw in the design that shows, if not the non-existence of the designer, at least the incompetence of the designer. So one of these things is wisdom teeth, right? If God designed humans to be the way they are, why is it that we have to have all these extra teeth grow in and either get them pulled or suffer enormous pain? Right? That doesn't make sense. Another thing that they will point to is the human blind spot, or the blind spot in the eye. The eye has different rods and cones that reflect and absorb light differently, and they all meet at the back of the eye where the optic nerve goes into the brain. And that spot is the blind spot. So this is why if you look out at the night sky, in order to see a star clearly, you actually have to avert your gaze by about 20 degrees to see a star clearly because of the human blind spot. It can't go directly into the optic nerve. It won't pick it up. And then finally, vestigial organs. You don't hear this as much these days, but in the past, this has been sort of a staple of Darwinian argument. Humans have things like appendices, you have an appendix. Books have appendices. Yeah, humans have an appendix. Sorry, I read too much. Tonsils, what possible function do tonsils have? It was thought. Sometimes if you look at the pelvis of a human being, you'll see a slight bony prominence that it serves no purpose for posture or gait or any sort of biomechanical usage, and it's thought to be perhaps the nub of our prehensile tail, perhaps. Okay, so these are the 5 lines of evidence for Darwinism that Darwinists typically use. These are at least 3 examples of dysteleology, why we should not think that humans were designed, but sort of came up by some sort of biological meandering. Okay, we're going to go through each of these lines of evidence individually. The first line of evidence was genetic similarities, like humans and chimpanzees share 90% of their code. Well, the problem with using that as evidence for common ancestry is that we also share something like 70% of our DNA with mice and something like 50% of our DNA with fungi, right? But does it mean that humans are 50% fungus? Some, usually bachelors. Yeah, and Dawn. Fungi, yeah. Yes. Wah, wah, wah. So the problem is that the only reason that we might think that this genetic similarity accounts for the similarity among the species is because we already think that the species is similar, usually on something like morphological grounds, right? They look similar, they act similar. Oh, look, they have similar genetics. Because you can actually run the argument the other way. Humans and chimpanzees shared 95% of their DNA. Humans, because of what we do, building societies and aircraft carriers and writing poetry, are obviously different qualitatively from chimpanzees. Therefore, genetic similarity is not a clue toward overall similarity. So you can run the argument backwards. Similarity in the coding. There's one other thing. Recently, there's been some debate over vitamin C deficiencies in humans and chimps, things like that. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but there are some people like Michael Behe, who is actually an intelligent design proponent, but he also thinks that there's some evidence for common ancestry among some species because of something like this, the vitamin C deficiency. Humans there are some species that make their own vitamin C. Humans can't make their own vitamin C, and chimps can't make their own vitamin C. And if we look at the vitamin C producing gene in other species, and we look at a similar gene in humans and chimps, we see something of a breakage in that gene, which makes us not be able to produce vitamin C. Right? This has been used as evidence for common ancestry, but I've read and I've spoken with some biochemists who say, well, it could be that gene because of its structure, has a similar weakness, right? And so it could be that the breakage is due to a similar weakness in that type of gene and not from common ancestry. So depending on what you presuppose about the evidence, you interpret the evidence different ways. So even the vitamin C deficiency argument is not overwhelming evidence for common ancestry or Darwinism. Now let's go to the idea that humans and basically all those species that we know of use the same sort of codons to code for the same sort of amino acids. We said that this was evidence that all life had a similar origin. Well, some of you may be familiar with Michael Denton's work. Michael Denton, back in 1985, wrote a book called Darwinism, a Theory in Crisis, where he sort of gives a quasi-philosophy of science overview of Darwinism, and he basically says Darwinism has a lot of problems with it, but it will dominate by inertia, basically, until some other theory comes along to supplant it. And no other theory really has come along to supplant it, so it just continues to dominate. Well, he wrote another book in 1998 called Nature's Destiny. And he addresses specifically this issue of common coding. And he says, if you look at the way in which the human genetics codes for amino acids, it is the most efficient system. Because from 4 underlying nucleic acids, you get 64, potentially 64 different combinations. And what we need is 22 of them. He says if you run the numbers of different sorts of base pairs, you wouldn't have one base pair, but 1, 2, 3, 4, and then up, what you get is if you don't have 4 base pairs, you don't have enough amino acids for life. And if you get 5 or 6 base pairs, you have way too many. There's too much redundancy. Basically, the animal is less efficient because it's carrying around all this biological stuff that it doesn't need. And so he says, it may be that there's some sort of underlying chemical necessity that made this type of coding the only sort of coding that life would have used. And if that's the case, then all life would have used it, even if it arose in individual origins. And so the fact that all life uses the same sort of coding isn't overwhelming evidence for Darwinism. At least, so says Michael Denton. Okay. Morphology. We talked about the pentadactyl forelimb, if you recall the pentadactyl forelimb. The problem with the pentadactyl forelimb, or this idea that morphology gives us evidence for common ancestry, is this. There are other places where evolutionists completely abandon morphology as a clue to similarities. I remember reading a book called What Evolution Is by Ernst Mayr. Now you may remember me mentioning Ernst Mayr because in the 1990s he was a really old guy, because he was there in the 1940s with Theodosius Dobzhansky ushering in the synthesis, the great synthesis between Darwinism and genetics. And so I got his book and I thought, oh great, if anybody's going to tell me what evolution is, it's Ernst Mayr, right? So I start reading through here, and right in the middle of the book, there's a great page with pictures on it. Now, reading the books that I read, I don't get to see a lot of pictures. So when I get to see one, it's actually a delight. So Ernst Mayr, as he's going through the book titled What Evolution Is, he comes to the idea of convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is something like this. We have animals in, say, Australia, and whatever you think of their rugby team, you have animals in Australia that are marsupial. Marsupial means when their offspring are born, they're born sort of in a stage of incomplete development, and they've finished their development in a pouch external to the mother's body. Like Australian rugby players, Simon says, for posterity's sake, right? As opposed to placental animals, and humans are placental animals, because the mother carries the offspring in its body the entire term and gives birth to a full-grown young. Fully developed young. They're not fully grown. That would be painful. Okay, so we have marsupial animals and we have placental animals. And marsupial reproduction and placental reproduction are so essentially diverse that no evolutionist thinks that marsupial animals and placental animals actually had a common ancestor. But the weird thing is this. You have animals on the American continents, and you have animals in Australia that look almost identical. The two that come to mind are this isn't Australia, but the Tasmanian wolf and one of the flying squirrels, one of the species of flying squirrels. In one continent, it's a marsupial, and another continent, it's a placental. Morphologically, they are nearly identical. So if morphology is a clue toward common ancestry, why is it that this flying squirrel and that flying squirrel don't have a common ancestor? It's not from their morphology, but from their soft tissue differences, namely their reproductive systems. So if morphology can be abandoned as a standard for perceiving common ancestry, then how can it be that because humans and, say, chimpanzees share some sort of close morphology, that it's a standard that says that they came from a common ancestor? If it's a standard for evolutionary development, then it's a standard. What happens is the evolutionist has his theory in place and then meets with anomalous data. This is data that the theory didn't predict and actually contradicts it in some way. And so what they do is they create another term, call it convergent evolution, and they use it as a positive. They say, well, look how powerful natural selection is. On two completely different continents, in two completely different lineages, it made the same organism. That's one way out of it. And the other way is to say, that's ad hoc. Ad hoc means you wouldn't have predicted that, and then when it came up, you made a sort of a side argument in order to save your original argument. Embryological development. Remember we talked about phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny. And so they look like that these organisms, as they're developing from their embryological state up to their full-grown state, they look similar. And so it's an evidence for common ancestry. Well, Jonathan Wells, in his book Icons of Evolution, says that's actually false. There's a guy named Haeckel who pushed this as an argument and evidence for the truth of Darwinian theory. And what Jonathan Wells does is he actually goes to embryologists. And he says, look at these woodcuts that the pictures of Haeckel's embryos come from. Look at these pictures. Are these accurate representations of human, fish, whatever these species that were said to be sort of parallel in their embryological development? And the embryologists say, no. What he's done is he's taken the fish embryo from stage 5 and moved it to stage 2 so that it looks similar to the human embryo. And he's taken this embryo from stage 8 and moved it, or from stage 3 and moved it to stage 8 so that they look similar. And so the reason Wells is concerned about this is because those sorts of pictures for generation after generation convince people that Darwin's theory had much more empirical support than it actually does. Now, something that Philip Johnson said that I really found profound is that, keep this in mind, the evolutionary biologist is not a scientific specialist, right? Scientific specialists go into some particular area like retrovirology, how retroviruses work. And they study some specific aspect of that. We had last summer Chart. Simon, what's Chart's last name? Smith. Chart Smith. Well, Chart, younger guy, he's about 30. Right. So he did his work on photosynthesis. And apparently there are 4 sort of biochemical engines in photosynthesis. And Chart's PhD was in one area detailing the work of one of these subsystems within the system of photosynthesis. That's scientific specialization. That's what professional scientists do. Evolutionary biologists do not do this. In order to gain evidence for their theory, they have to borrow from chemistry and biochemistry, molecular biology. They have to borrow from genetics. They have to borrow from embryology. They have to borrow from the historical data from paleontology. And then from all these things, they cobble together evidence for their general theory. Right? Now that's not bad. I mean, there's nothing necessarily illicit about that. But when you draw evidence from embryology to support your general theory, and the embryologists are telling you that you're using the evidence wrong, you need to listen to them. One of the things that Philip Johnson does, I think brilliantly, in his Darwin on Trial, second edition was in 1993. Philip Johnson is the sort of the grandfather of the modern intelligent design movement, is he showed that all of these sciences that impinge on this general theory of Darwin, Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution has elements that can be quantified, and so mathematicians can comment on it. It has elements that it borrows from chemistry, and so chemists can comment on it, right? What he said was that when you go through the chemists and the mathematicians and the embryologists and the paleontologists, there's a deviation rather, between what these experts are saying about their own specific discipline and the way in which it's being exploited by the generalist. So, for example, Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, in the 1970s wrote a paper with Lyell Eldredge called Punctuated Equilibria. And in the 60s, as a graduate student, Gould and Eldredge went to the Burgess Shale fossil site, I think it's in South Dakota, because there's a side of a mountain that basically sheared off, and it displays all this fossil record. And what they did is they went looking to verify Darwinian gradualism. So they studied and they measured hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the same organism from these different rock strata. And finally, after all of this, they write this journal article called Punctuated Equilibria. And Stephen Jay Gould says this in his book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. He says microevolutionary, I should say that. He says what we see in the fossil record is these species pop into existence seemingly from nowhere. They go on, sometimes for millions of years, in stasis, and they go extinct. He says, now, there are some instances that gradualism looks like it's supported in the fossil record, but the dominant pattern, 95% of the fossil record looks punctuated and not gradual. So he starts a different variation on the Darwinian theme called punctuated equilibria, or punctuated equilibrium. The idea that Darwinian gradualism is false, right? So the fossil record is not necessarily a strong line of evidence for the Darwinist, right? When we look closer at it, there are problems. And I'm not saying that it's impossible that Darwinists could address these. They might be able to. But at this point, if somebody just gives you the fossil record, there are problems with that, and there are problems that paleontologists are aware of. Okay. Second thing that we can know about the fossil record is that it's woefully incomplete. Although there may be this general trend from simple organisms to more complex organisms, there are huge gaps in the fossil record. In the 1980s and 90s, another group among the Paleontological Society grew up called cladists or cladists. And they developed a science that they call cladistics. And Henry Gee, who's a cladist, who wrote a book called In Search of Deep Time, he says, look, the only reason, he says, we look at the fossil record. Here we have a fossil, and then there's nothing for 10 or 20 or 35 million years, and then we have another fossil. Then we draw a genealogical line from fossil A to fossil B, and we call this the ancestor and this the descendant. He says there's no possible way that we could empirically verify that. As a scientist, his default position, quite rightly, is skepticism. Your theory, you say your theory is true, give me the evidence. That's the scientific mind, right? They don't take things on faith, or they're not supposed to, until it comes to Jesus, and then they can take that on faith. And so what Gee says is that fossil A and fossil B are, as he puts it, just two things that got spewed out of the well of deep time. What he calls geologic time, he calls deep time. Because humans who live in terms of hours, days, weeks, and years, and decades, don't really have a concept, don't have a practical concept of millions of years, tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, or billions of years. And so for the paleontologist to just come along and go, yeah, here we have a fossil, and then 10 million years later, wait, 10 million years? 10 million years. How is this not just guesswork? So I'm not saying they're not possibly right. I'm saying they can't know that for sure. And so for the evolutionist to believe his theory, that's one thing. For him to believe it dogmatically and expect you to believe it is it something else entirely? I mean, Dawkins says that people who don't believe evolutionary theory are crazy, wicked, or insane. No, that's the same thing. What is it? Yeah, or it's something. No, not crazy and insane, but something wicked or insane. Stupid. Stupid, wicked, or insane. That's what it is. How stupid of me. Yeah. So what I don't like about Darwinism is the academic bullying, right? You have to believe this, and if you don't see it the way we see it, you're either stupid, wicked, or insane, or evil, but I don't like to contemplate that. That's the rest of the quote. So what I'm saying is that the Darwinian dogma, we haven't proven that Darwinism's false, but we have said that we can be reasonably skeptical about it. That the evidence is not overwhelming, despite what the popular Darwinists say. And then finally, the evidence from microevolutionary biology. I don't have a problem with microevolutionary biology. Why? Because it's empirical. It's testable. But to say that because bacteria develop a resistance to antibiotics, evolution is true over the 3.5 billion years of life on Earth, that's what we call in philosophy a hasty induction. A hasty induction is when you go from some small bit of evidence to some grand position that this evidence couldn't possibly support. This is where things like racial stereotypes come in. Well, I've met 3 people of this kind, and they were all this way, therefore this entire population group is that way. It's a hasty induction. And Darwinists do something similar. They don't have overwhelming evidence from the fossil record. They can't, this is what Stephen Jay Gould said about microevolutionary biology. He said, it is not possible to take microevolutionary principles, stretch them out over geologic time, and explain macroevolution. You can't do that. This is Stephen Jay Gould. He's an agnostic. He's a Harvard paleontologist. He doesn't like Christianity. He actually, in his personal life, memorized huge portions of Scripture to be used with his friends as jokes. He likes making fun of us. But he also, as a scientist, doesn't think that microevolutionary principles are evidence for macroevolution. Okay. When am I supposed to be done, Rudolph? At 8? So 4 minutes ago? All right, I'm almost done. I'm on the last half page of notes. Okay. Now, it's not the case that we only have negative arguments against Darwinism. In the 1990s, we saw arguments being made by Michael Behe in his book Darwin's Black Box, and then later in 2006, his book The Edge of Evolution, where he argues, first of all, that there is no good evidence for the irreducible complexity of these things, and then in his 2006 Edge of Evolution, he shows that there cannot be a Darwinian explanation of these complex molecular biological systems. Well, the ID, the intelligent design guy that I like, who I wrote on in my dissertation and invited to my defense, is William A. Dembski. William Dembski is a mathematician who in 1998, through Cambridge University, published a book called The Design Inference. Now, Bill is the biggest nerd you'll ever see. I love the guy. He's super nice. He's a Christian, loves Jesus, and he's a nerd. He's got 2 PhDs. One's in mathematics. The other's in the philosophy of mathematics. But he's also got an MDiv from Princeton. And at Princeton, he was involved in a very small group of people interested in Christian apologetics. And Bill is now a research professor at SCS. Why? Because with all of his clout, all of his academic credentials, he loves the Lord and he's interested in protecting the mind of the church. Not just protecting the mind of the church, but going on the offensive to those who would undermine it. And in Dembski's work, he argues this. Remember, he's a mathematician and he's making a mathematical argument about the information found in the genetic code as information, not as biological, but as information. There's a way in which information can be simple or complex. So if you look at a string of letters that just goes A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, that's a simple information system. Something like a salt crystal is a simple information system. It's just sodium and chloride in this repeated pattern. right? Now, if I took the letters A, B, D, H, Z, J, J, that's actually complex. It's more complex than A, B, A, B, A, B. But complexity is not the only thing that we see in the human genetic code. We also see specificity. So even though the H, G, J, Z is more complex than A, B, A, B, it doesn't do anything. There's no function to which it ends. It's just sort of bare complexity, we might say. Now, specificity might be something like this. I think that I shall never see something as lovely as a tree. That statement has both complexity and specificity. Why does it have specificity? Because it has some specific end, namely the communication of that one line of verse, right? Probability. So these are all parts of Dembski's argument. Complexity, specificity, probability. Probability, what he argues is that directionless processes can be eliminated if the probability of their success is what he calls vanishingly small. So you get into an argument with somebody and you're asking about how something could have happened. How could that guy do that? And somebody says, well, by chance. Well, there's a science that studies chance. It's the science of the mathematics of probability. And what Dembski has argued is that if somebody's going to give chance as an explanation for some complex feature in the world, that explanation can be eliminated as viable if the probability for that event happening by chance is what he calls vanishingly small. Well, what is the criteria for vanishingly small? And this is where Bill comes up with his upper probability bound. The upper probability bound or boundary is something like this. There are approximately 10 to the 80th fundamental particles in the known universe. All right? That's protons, electrons, and neutrons. Everything that makes up the stuff that we have, there's about 10 to the 80th of those. Okay? The fastest rate at which these things can change is 10 to the 45th seconds, or 10 to the negative 45th seconds. That's how fast, for example, an electron can collapse from one electron shell to the other. About 10 to the negative 45th seconds. That's how fast matter can change. Now, if you assume that the universe is about 14 billion years old, there have been 10 to the 35 seconds since the Big Bang. Now, you know that when you multiply exponentials, you add them together. This means taking as many seconds as we have since the Big Bang, as much matter as there is in the universe, and as fast as it can possibly change, we get an upper probability bound of about 10 to the 150th. That means that any event in the known universe that is less probable than 10 to the 150th could not possibly have happened. And actually, for the Darwinian explanation, it's a little bit harder, because the Darwinist is talking about life on Earth, and Earth hasn't been around for 14 billion years. The earliest life is about 3.5 billion years. So if you give them about 4 billion years, now you have not 10 to the 35th seconds, but something like 10 to the 8th, right? And so what we find is that, and I'm not going to do these equations for you because I don't know them. I just take them on faith from the mathematicians, that if you take proteins that are very, very short, even something like 100 amino acid chains, proteins have a complex specificity because they have to do something, and on top of that, they have a three-dimensional structure. So the protein, to do its job, actually has to fold into a specific structure. So the probability that a protein of about 100 amino acid lengths, getting there's about 20 or 22 amino acids to choose from, getting 100 of those in just the right order, and then getting it to fold into just the right shape, the probability of that happening by chance, given all the possibilities, is about 1 times 10 to the 400th. So if you want to play this game of something happening by chance, okay, let's look at the science of chances, probability. The upper probability bound of 10 to the 150th, and the probability that this very small protein came into its existence by chance is vanishingly small, and therefore we can eliminate chance as a explanation. So that's sort of the nature of the design challenge to evolutionary biology. Now, again, I'm not trying to paint a picture that everything has been settled, But what I am saying is that at least Darwinian dogmatism is illicit. It's untoward. It should not be. So if you believe in Darwinism, you should, like a good scientist, recognize the limitations that the theory has, the holes that it needs to plug, and therefore what it needs to do in the future to become a stronger scientific paradigm. But that's how we talk about it as a science. The bad thing is it's spilled the banks of the university, and it's become something dominant in the culture. It's become an idea that drives people toward moral relativism. The idea that we don't have to take any consequences for our actions, that man is not something endowed with rationality or made by God, but it's something that just happened, right? And so that is the long and the long of the sort of the development of evolutionary biology from its origin in the Origin of Species, its evolution through the 20th century in the neo-Darwinian synthesis, and then the problems that it's had over the last 2 decades or so, how scientists, even within the community, have been giving up pieces of Darwinism, gradualism, a narrative view of the fossil record, and how recently there's a very, very strong challenge to the Darwinian narrative from the science of information. And that's the end of my notes. And I took a lot of time. And now it's your turn to ask questions.
Awesome. I think if you have any question on evolution itself, you're welcome to come and ask your question. Arnu.
Hi.
Hello.
I had many people ask me that the Bible said that all creation was created in 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested.
Yeah.
But it also says that 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like 1 day. So, can you actually say that it was 7 days, or could it have been longer? Is it possible that God created man, but over a longer period of time? Not actually, not actually just man, but creation. Mm-hmm. Is it possible?
Yes, yeah, it's possible. And this is a good question because it goes into the more theological issue of not evolution versus intelligent design, which is an inter-scientific debate. I mean, Dembski is not citing Scripture; he's referring to principles in philosophy, in probability and mathematical information theory, which is what I find attractive about it as an apologetic, because it gets around the objection, well, I don't believe the Bible. Well, do you believe math? But the question is good, because as Christians, we want to know how our understanding of the science is actually melded with revelation, what God has revealed about himself, creation, man. And the truth of the matter is there are about 4 positions that I'm aware of that I would consider orthodox. Yeah, I'm going to say that. There's a 5th position that I think honest Christians can hold but are mistaken in holding, and that's theistic evolution. But I don't disagree with theistic evolutionists on the ground that it somehow makes them non-Christians. I disagree with them because I don't think evolution as a science is overwhelmingly plausible or persuasive, right? So the 4 positions that I think are orthodox in our understanding of Genesis 1 is, first of all, young earth creationism, obviously. Young earth creationists, they're very concerned with interpreting the text in the way that the text presents itself, right? And so the young earth creationists, the strongest position that they stand on is, look, we're reading the Bible as the Bible presents itself, okay? And when we do that, we're on the best sort of theological ground. So if the Bible says that, if we can reason this way, about 6,000 years ago, that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, who is Richard Dawkins or Alistair McGrath even to disagree with that, right? This is the position of the young earth creationist. And it's orthodox, right? The problem is, in my mind, is I'm motivated by Christian apologetics. Young earth creationism is a valid position in the Christian community. One of my best friends and one of my favorite professors, Dr. Richard Howe at SES, is a young earth creationist. He's an extremely bright and intelligent guy, and I wouldn't say anything else. But he doesn't use young earth creationism as a platform to do apologetics. Why? Because by nature, apologetics is trying to give reasons to somebody who doesn't believe. And the young earth creationist position is usually focused mainly on a correct hermeneutic of a biblical text. Does the non-Christian give a rip about a correct hermeneutic of the biblical text? No. So it's not a common ground upon which we can stand and have dialogue about the Christian faith, right? It's something that we should settle in our own mind, sure. But I think young earth creationism, however strong it enjoys a contingent among Christians, doesn't give us a valid platform for apologetics. And so I would say that if you are a young earth creationist, I would take Richard Howe as my model, then find another platform that you can use to do your apologetics over science, right? Because it's not practical to use that as a starting point. The other is old earth creationism. This is people like Hugh Ross and Fuzz Rana, the Reasons to Believe crowd. Hugh Ross has come and taught at the school. I love Hugh Ross. He is an egghead. He's an astrophysicist, right? And so when you talk to him, he has a very scientific answer for just about everything. Why is it that we need toilet paper in the bathroom? Well, let me tell you why we need toilet paper. I mean, Hugh's great. He's just very, very analytic, which is what makes him a good astrophysicist, and perhaps not the best luncheon mate, right? But whatever. So old earth creationism says that the days of creation aren't necessarily to be taken literally. And in fact, what they represent are eons of time over which the universe and then the earth progressed in this mode of creation. God certainly created all that, but day one actually corresponds to this particular, the first 8 billion years of the development of the universe. Day two, when Scripture says that, what that means is this next 4 billion years of development of the created universe. And he goes down the line, and he shows why he thinks that regarding the biblical text as it relates to modern science. Okay? There's another position called non-concordism. Young earth creationism and old earth creationism are both forms of what we call concordism. And you know what means for two things to accord or concord. It means that they're trying to take the biblical account and make it concord with some evidence in modern science. In the young earth creationist account, they're going to have to explain things why the speed of light may not be constant, why it may be variable, and that's why we can have starlight but have a different age of the universe, things like that. So in both camps, they're trying to make a concordance with Genesis 1 and modern science. I personally am a non-concordist. And I'm a non-concordist for similar reasons that a young earth creationist is a young earth creationist. I think there are hermeneutical issues to be taken into account. And the hermeneutical issues that we normally take when approaching a text are who wrote the text, who is his original audience, and in what historical context. We do this, for example, for the book of Corinthians. Who's writing it? Paul, the Apostle Paul. When? Around 54 AD, something like that. To whom? The Corinthians. Well, where's Corinth? And who lived there? And why might he be saying these things, right? We say these as part of our historical grammatical hermeneutic. And when we ask those similar questions about Genesis 1, we get answers like this from conservative theologians. Moses wrote it, as revealed by God, around, say, 1400 BC, to the an early Hebraic population, the Hebrews, who had just come out of 430 years of slavery in Egypt and moved to Canaan. And so when we read Genesis 1, and I get this position from a man named Tommy Briscoe, who taught me biblical backgrounds at Southwestern, and Tommy had two PhDs. I call him Tommy, he's like 60 years old. That's probably not right. Dr. Briscoe had two PhDs, one in Old Testament, one in biblical archaeology. And so he's very concerned about us having an accurate historical understanding of the ancient Near East. And the reason Dr. Briscoe was a non-concordist is he says, look, there is no way that Genesis 1 should be read in light of 20th and 21st century modern science. He says that when Moses is writing Genesis 1 to the Hebraic people coming out of slavery in Egypt and going to settle in Canaan, they're coming out of a polytheistic culture with a pantheon of gods, and they're going into a region dominated by polytheism. So the purpose of Genesis 1 is not to give us a scientific account of creation. The purpose of Genesis 1 is to give us what's called a polemic, an argument against the pantheon of Egypt and the pantheon of Canaan. So in Egypt, they had, maybe you've heard of, no, I forgot the pharaoh's name now. Anyway, Amun. Amun was the sun god, and it was a dominant deity in Egypt, right? What does it say in Genesis 1? God created the sun, the moon, and the stars, right? So you go to Canaan, and they're worshiping the moon. And what does Genesis 1 say? God created the moon, and man, and animals on the earth, and in the sea, and the sky, and the ground, and the light and the darkness. There isn't anything in all creation that didn't originally come from Yahweh, the one creator God. So the non-concordist says that I'm not trying to make Genesis 1 concord with modern science, because I think on other hermeneutical grounds, not textual, but more historical, we have a reason to read this as a polemic. And then when we get into Genesis 2, this is what Dr. Briscoe says, this is why there's two creation accounts. One that is polemical and sort of cosmic, the other one that says God made a man and a woman and placed them in a garden, and that garden was between these four headwaters, including the Tigris and the Euphrates. Historical, geographic conditions. And so somebody asks you why there's two creation accounts. One's polemical, the other one's historical. And so some of the criticisms that I've heard about non-concordism is that, well, now you don't have a literal Adam and Eve. And that would be a valid argument if what I was saying is that, for example, the first 11 chapters of Genesis were to be read allegorically. I'm not saying that. I'm saying Genesis 1 is a polemic, and Genesis 2 starts the literal historical account of the special creation of Adam and Eve. You can't get rid of a historical Adam and Eve. Whatever you think about Genesis, Jesus and Paul clearly talk about a historical Adam. And so I'll just, as a sidebar to my sidebar, Tim Keller, pastor in New York, very, very bright, apologetically minded man. I read in an article by one of our magazines, Christianity Today. I don't know if you guys said that. But the article was on this emerging science of genomics, where they're looking at genomes in their entirety and talking about how they might have emerged or what their relationships are, right? And so this well-known genomic scientist was saying that if we go back as far as we can go in genomics, and the discipline is not that old, he says that the human population had to, at a minimum, have started with 10,000 individuals to get the sort of diversity that we see today. And so they asked, Christianity Today asked a number of theologians and pastors to comment on this most recent development, and Tim Keller said something that was great. He said, look, if genomics says that there had to be an early population of 10,000 individuals, and Jesus and Paul say that it started with Adam, I'm going to side with Jesus and Paul. Now, he didn't reference this, but if you look at the history of the sciences, does a science that's only about 10 or 15 years old have it all figured out? Usually not. And so why would we give up something that is very clear theologically for a scientific proposition that's probably going to be overthrown in the next 5 or 10 years? That's a bad deal. And so the fourth position, so that's young earth creationism, old earth creationism, and non-concordism. The fourth position that I just read recently, and I find fascinating, and I want to look into it more, is John Lennox's 7 Days That Divide the World. And I love Dr. Lennox's approach because he talks about how the church in the, I think 14th, there you go, 7 Days That Divide the World. It's not a very long read, but it's a very interesting one. And what John says, I mean, he does a really good job about first setting up historically. Next, being very, very intent at looking at the biblical evidence. He doesn't just say, well, the science tells me this, therefore whatever you believe. No, he's actually looking at the text and trying to delineate what the text is saying. But one of the things he does to preface this is he says, look at what happened during the time of Galileo and the church's response to a heliocentric rather than a geocentric view of our solar system. The sun is at the center rather than the earth being at the center of our solar system. And what John says is that assuming that a geocentric view there were religious figures in that day that says, no, look, the Bible says that God has set his earth on its foundations and it is unmoved. How then could the earth then rotate or orbit the sun? That's a violation of Scripture, right? Does that sound familiar? Yeah. And so Dr. Lennox is saying, look, we need to, as Christians, learn from history. From the history of Christianity and from the history of the sciences, we need to learn what it is that the sciences can teach us about our own holy text. Because now we know that the earth does in fact orbit the sun. Therefore, that text that was so crucial to their argument needs to be read in a different way. That doesn't commit the Christian to the fact that the earth is absolutely immutable. No. We look at the structure of our solar system and go, okay, well, that text doesn't need to be read in some bone literal way. Right? Does that infect or impair our Christianity? No. And as honest thinkers, we present an apologetic to the world that isn't crazy. Right? And so what John says is that he's very interested in the chronology of the first 6 days. And what he says is this: it's possible to have both a literal 6-day creationism and long eons, because the Bible doesn't comment on how much time was between each of the creative acts. So it could have been that on day 1, God speaks and ushers in the first phase of creation. And he does that in a literal 24-hour period. And then at some point in the future, contiguous with that phase, he starts another phase, phase 2. And in one 24-hour period, he speaks, and another phase of the complex created order that we live in was started. So he thinks that it's both, that these could have been literal days on which God does things, but what they usher in is overlapping and contiguous phases of creation. And so what I want from us as a body is to understand that there are multiple different readings of this verse that have different strengths, and you've got to decide for yourself which is the weightiest position. Is having a strict literal interpretation the most important thing? If so, young earth creation is probably where you're going to land. If measuring out and delineating the phases of cosmological development is the most important thing, then something like Hugh Ross's old earth creationism is probably the case. Or the non-concordism that I explained, or John Lennox's version. Right?
Any other question?
I figure if I just talk long enough, I can only have one question.
No, we're going to keep you here until about 10. So.
This is not really a question. I'm just really referring to King James Version. Mm-hmm. And this is a question that a lot of people, that the guy earlier asked. And he asked, did God really created heaven and earth, in 6 days? And my theory, or I don't know how to say it in English, I'm not very good in English, is that yes, God really did. We serve an amazing God. And the Bible is specific when it says, and it was evening and it was morning the first day, and so forth until the 6th day. So it says specifically, it was evening and it was morning the first day. It was evening and morning the second day. So this is what King James says. So this is my answer to people that ask, did God really created the world in 6 days? Yes, he did, because this is what my Bible says.
Okay, well, if we're going to reverse roles here, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
What was your name?
Jackie.
Jackie. Yes. Nice to meet you, Jackie. Do you hate your father and mother?
No, I love them.
I thought you were a Christian. But Jesus says, if you do not hate your father and mother, you cannot come after me and you cannot be my disciple. The Bible is clear. It literally says, and it's very clear that Jesus says, you must hate your father and mother or else you cannot be my disciple.
I love God more than my mother and father.
But that's not what it says. It doesn't say love God more. It says you must hate your father and mother. And if you don't hate your father and mother, you can't be a Christian.
But where does this come in with this?
Where it comes in is this. If you demand, absolutely demand, without interpretation, what the text literally says, then you don't allow for things like literary genre or hyperbole. So how do we explain what Jesus means when he says you must hate your father and mother? Of course he doesn't literally mean that. He's using hyperbole. He's using an exaggeration to make a point. And it's the point that you made. You love God more than your parents, but he's not saying that you have to hate your parents, right? So in the same way, I think it's not the strongest position to say, look, we always take the Bible literally. This is what the Bible literally says, so it has to be this way. Because the truth of the matter is, people that love Jesus, love God's Word, and have a mind devoted to the truth have come down on different positions. So, thanks.
Spiritually, but this was just the answer that I received.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Jackie.
Another question.
Uh-oh. Question from the pastor.
No, not as much a question, but
Oh, good.
what you have apart from amazing me with the fascinating is, I think, the right word, with the subject matter, is the fact that apologetically one needs to find the interface between the person that doesn't agree that the Bible is the absolute truth.
That's right.
And in order to not only commence dialogue, but to progress a dialogue, you need to find a colloquial ground.
That's right.
And I think this is the important thing that we should take with us this evening, is that in order to have a meaningful discussion with somebody that you want to lead to Jesus, you have to talk, you have to do as the Romans do. You have to speak in a colloquial sense.
That's right.
That he or she understands. And I have never been as solidly under the impression as I am this evening after listening to what you've had to say to us. But it just opened up the need to find the common ground in order to effectively lead somebody to Jesus.
Absolutely.
It doesn't have to be complicated, but you will not be able to improvise if you don't understand the principles yourself.
Yes.
If you know the principles and the truth, you will be able to find the common ground.
Yes. Thank you. And let me just agree with that emphatically, and then say this. I had the privilege of teaching at a Bible college a few days ago, and we started out talking about the difference between apologetics and evangelism. And I think I taught evangelism for 3 years in the Bible college before I graduated to the to the graduate students. No, when I was asked what classes I wanted to teach in the undergrad, I picked Intro to Philosophy, and then I also picked evangelism, because I thought Intro to Philosophy, that's just my area, so that's easy. Evangelism, because that's hard. Now, it may be funny to say that evangelism is hard and philosophy is easy, but evangelism is something practical. But the thing that, because we're very interested in apologetics at SES, the one thing I wanted our students to get clear, and keep this in mind, I'm not saying that apologetics and evangelism are separate. I am saying that they're distinct. Like two sides of a coin are distinct, but they're not separate. So don't hear me say that apologetics and evangelism are separate. But in evangelism, what we're doing is we're opening the Word, or at least verbally, we're expressing to people the news of the gospel in the hopes that God has prepared them and the Holy Spirit is going to draw them to Himself. In apologetics, we're focused on the human mind. And we're focused on human reasons that somebody might not be able to believe that there is a God, that Jesus is His Son, that Jesus lived historically, things like that. Okay, so that's part of it that I think is important. The other thing is that I pointed them to one of my favorite, I think, apologetic passages, and that's 1 Corinthians 9. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul says this, to those having the law, to the Jews, I become like a Jew, so that I might save some of the Jews. To those not having the law, I become like one not having the law, to win some that do not have the law. I become all things to all men, that I might save some. And if we look in Acts 17, when Paul says the law, he's referring to the Mosaic law, right? So when he goes to the synagogue, he reasons from the Scriptures to the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. When he goes to Athens, he says, men of Athens, I see that you guys are in all ways religious. I even found an altar to an unknown God. Now, this God that you worship as unknown, let me share with you. Does he talk about the Mosaic law and Jesus being the Messiah? No. He gets them from their pantheon of gods to the one true God that they don't know. And he uses their culture and what he knows about it as an entrance into sharing the gospel with them. And so this is what the pastor is saying, is that you need to find the common ground. What is it that you and I share? If you don't believe and I do believe, maybe it's movies. Oh, did you see this movie? You remember when that guy did that? Why do you think that that was immoral? What is the standard for morality? It's got to be an ultimate, unchanging ground that all men call God. What did you just do? You found a common ground, some movie that you've both seen, some book that you've both read. You've raised a question to them that they may not have thought of and showed them how ultimately God, his existence, is the answer to that question. Right? You're doing what Paul did. To those not believing the Bible, you don't use the Bible. You use whatever else they believe and show them how God is the ultimate ground of that. And what are you doing by doing that? You're loving others. The second greatest commandment behind loving God with all your mind is loving others as you love yourself. How can we do that if we don't use our minds in order to share the gospel with people who are immortal? They will die, and they will go on to be in heaven with God or in hell, punished for their unbelief and their sins. That's what motivates evangelism, and that's what should motivate apologetics.
Any other questions? Teresa, come. Quick question.
Yes.
Chemical evolution, fact or fiction? No, I'm just teasing. Come, Teresa.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that one, and also Pastor Willie, the common ground, because I often find that people don't believe in the Bible, and then, how do I relate to them?
Yes.
But the thing I want to ask is, do you think that the human race is or can be affected by mutation? If you think about Genesis and the Nephilim, and also when they went into the promised land and they were wiping, God said that they must wipe out the land of Canaan and everybody. If you think about the giants, and now after that period, what has been going on? Has there been any mutation physically or spiritually?
I'm not prepared, because the question of the Nephilim, I know our Old Testament professor Tom Howe, who's an expert in Hebrew, could probably answer that question. I cannot. I will say this: yes, mutation happens to humans. It's responsible for, of the thousands of mutations that we know of, they all cause deleterious effects in humans. That is, they cause diseases, right? Down syndrome, right? Lou Gehrig's disease, right? Alzheimer's. These are all genetic mutations that, and this is again, evolutionists arguing contrary to fact. Every mutation that we're aware of doesn't make somebody smarter and faster and superhuman. It makes them weaker, and it shortens their lifespan. It makes them dumber, right? It makes them not be able to function well, right? In terms of spiritual mutation, that's a category mistake. Mutation has to do with something that is physical. It's specifically genetic. Spiritual, but we can't have spiritual change. And the greatest spiritual change that we see is when somebody goes from non-believer to a believer. That's the radical spiritual change. And then on a continuum after belief, we get more and more holy as we pursue God through His Spirit in Christ Jesus. So there is spiritual change, but there's no such thing as spiritual mutation. That would be like saying, I gained 5 spiritual pounds. Yeah, I rode my spiritual bike here today. So, yeah.
Awesome. Any other question? Auntie Maury? The cable is not long enough.
My head is smoking.
Okay.
So I just want to ask a simple question.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Somebody once said that in Genesis 1, verse 1, you actually get a state of chaos with a spirit hovering over the waters.
Yeah.
It's explained like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now somebody asked, why would a God that can create such brilliance and such beauty why would God first create chaos and then from that
Produce order.
produce order? Now, I've only heard this, I think, 3 times in my whole life, that somebody argue that there was a pre-Adamitic
Yeah.
world. And
Yes.
for some reason, God destroyed that world and created from that in 6 days.
Yeah.
Now, to me, that explains dinosaurs, all those.
Right.
You see, so that to me is
The best
what
explanation.
happened.
Okay.
I accepted that, and to me, that's the explanation.
Good. Okay. Yeah, what she's referring to is called the gap theory. And the gap theory takes Genesis 1:2, where it says, now the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Right? The gap theory says this, that there was some primordial creation or primary creation. And I think the way they trail it is this. That included the angels and the known universe. And it included all the dinosaurs, all the ancient fossils that we see. And then when Satan fell, he infected the creation somehow. And so God destroyed that, and then out of that sort of primordial chaos, recreated and then put Adam in the garden. And so that's why we have an earth with all the fossils and stuff. And my critique of that position, or my response or analysis would be this. You're using one verse, that is Genesis 1:2, to build a very, very complex and specific theodicy or theology. And that's sort of a hermeneutical principle that I'm uncomfortable with, because it's something similar that like cultists use. They'll take one particular verse and they'll build something off of that that we can't really test against Scripture or reality. And the same thing is true of this. But I would say this, to the question of why would God create chaos only to bring order to it. Now, I'm not sure exactly how God created, but we might say this. We might say that the initial singularity was chaotic, and out of that God brought order. But the term chaos refers to basically something like this. It's an amount of disorder that overwhelms us conceptually, right? Is there any amount of disorder that could ever overwhelm an infinite mind? No. So if the term chaos is going to be interpreted in that passage as this extreme amount of disorder, is that disorder to God? No. Everything that we've ever encountered in life, and this is something that Chart said when he was studying photosynthesis. Within each of these 4 phases or 4 processing things of photosynthesis, within there's a sort of a very wiry, complex configuration of little, not dye, but little packets of coloring, right? They're the things that enable it to absorb light in a certain way. And he said, for the longest time, they thought this is just this random mess of little but when they probe it deeper and deeper, they found that there's actually a specific order there. So I'm not sure that the creation could ever be so disordered that it was actually disordered to God. But again, Tom Howe is our Old Testament guy, and I think what he would say is that there's some Hebraism, there's some purpose that the author puts that in, because as he develops Genesis through the first 10 or 11 chapters, he's going to use that in some overarching hermeneutical way. So, but I'm not sure. I'm looking at you guys, and you guys are looking down. Do you know anything that Thomas said about this? Genesis 1:2? Yeah, Simon. Well, but what would his response to a gap theory be?
His response, I think his response is to say that, agree with you to some extent, that it's difficult to take one verse there. Although sometimes we're left with some verse and we can speculate. That's all we can have a humble. You guys are really grasping now.
Yeah. Okay. One of the challenges with dealing with the Genesis account is in a few in a few verses it talks about the creation of the universe, which is a rather large event, if you consider that. The vast majority of the Bible, if you look at the length of the Bible, doesn't really concern itself too much with creation, although it's rather significant. But I mean, quickly it goes through creation in the first 2 chapters, and then what are we into? We are onto Adam and Eve, and then the Jews, and the beginning of the Jewish nation, and on it goes. So it seems that the emphasis is on God's relationship with men more so than that He created men. And so there's a large debate over what exactly is going on in Genesis. And so it's difficult to take one verse, as JT said, and develop a fully orbed position. Although I would argue that it's okay for you to speculate, and if you think that you're persuaded by that position, then that's fine, because there's a number of people who are in agreement with you. There's a number of people who are in agreement with this lady over here who hold to a young earth position. A number of our professors at our institution hold to that position because they think that the text, when you interpret it, demands that it be understood as this lady explained. But there are also folks who think that you can still respectfully interpret the text, okay, in a way in which you might understand the world to be millions of years old, okay? This is a huge debate in the United States. And then there's a whole bunch of us which go, well, look, you guys this is an important discussion that you're having, but the Muslims are coming. And so they think there's other more interesting things to talk about, for example, than the age of the earth, which is a very important discussion that we need to have. But that we need to have that discussion with humility, okay? This is one of the big problems. This debate that JT is referencing to, is surrounding this discussion, leads to a lot of dissension within the church, okay? What did Jesus say about dissension? He's rather serious about that. And so this is my concern, because I have interacted and met with the best young earth professors in the United States. I've met and worked with some of the professors who work with Ken Ham's ministry. Those of you who are young earthers here will know all about Answers in Genesis. I've also met with the other Answers in Genesis ministry, ICR people. This is Henry Morris's crowd, okay? I also have worked with Reasons to Believe. They're the old earthers, okay? We invite them to our place and we say, look, make your case, argue for your position, but do that with respect, okay? And that's the important thing as well. I think that it's important that we as Christians, when we decide on these positions, that we should have comfort to say, well, look, this is a difficult passage. It's 2 passages giving us account of the whole of creation. And so out of those passages, we have to mine an explanation for the whole of creation. There's a lot that's going on there to demand of just 2 chapters. Because the point of Genesis is to give us an account, and this is where I like JT's position in some sense, so I like a bit out of all of these positions. I like what his account is, that if you look at that Genesis account, it's very consistent with a lot of creation accounts that you find in the ancient religions of that time. Bearing in mind, the people of that time had a particular familiarity with their own literature. And so the Genesis account wouldn't have been odd to them. It's like if, for example, if I send a text or a Twitter message to somebody who was living in the 1950s with all of the little things, they would go, what on earth does that mean? Because it's appropriate to our context. Well, so too when we look back to the Genesis account and we see that it's like the other ancient accounts in mythology, we would expect to find those things to be sort of the same because it's written during that time. But it doesn't follow from that therefore the Bible has just pinched this off of these ancient cultures, which is what the critics say. Okay? So I think in this whole discussion on Genesis, that we need to, each of us, honor God and work through it yourselves. Read the different positions. You might be persuaded by some arguments on the one camp. You might be persuaded by... I sort of stand at the moment and I find some of the arguments made by the young earth people, specifically in geology, to be extremely persuasive. I find the arguments from the old earth guys in astronomy to be particularly persuasive. Okay? So I'm thinking, well, guys, this is great. I find that persuasive. I find that persuasive. But it seems to me like the jury is still... There's still work to be done here. So in light of that, let's conduct this debate with humility and maturity and academic vigor, because who knows, maybe the young earthers, in the end, as more science and more evidence is processed and the more we study this, it'll sort of be like what happened 500 years ago. Who of you believes that the sun revolves around the earth? Who of you believes that? Nobody believes that. We all believe that that's the earth revolving around the sun. Well, 500 years ago, everybody believed that the sun was in the middle of the universe. The earth was in the middle of the universe. That's what everybody believed. But science has shown us what? No, the earth is spinning, and it's tilted on an axis, and in 1 year, it takes 1 year for the earth to go around the sun. Okay, so everybody who was a Christian 500 years ago had the wrong view. Because the Bible says that the Bible is founded on pillars, so therefore the world must be standing still. Well, science has come to show us that no, it doesn't mean the Bible is inconsistent. Okay, we can understand some of these passages and metaphor without corrupting or thinking that the Bible doesn't have any integrity to it. But it's a good way for us to go back in time and see an instance where there has been tension between, those who believe that the earth was standing still and those who believe that the earth didn't. That's why John Lennox's book, if you get a chance, I encourage you to read this book. It's called 7 Days That Divide the World, where I think this is one of the best things that has been written to help the Christian community more specifically, because we debate this issue so vigorously, on how we might think carefully about this issue. And the man who wrote this book, where's he going to be speaking? At Potch, just down the road here. So if you've got questions, he's a good guy to go and listen to, So I that's my take on the whole spiel.
Thanks. I think Simon raises a few issues that I think are well said. First of all, is Christian unity over things that are non-essential. And if I made you uncomfortable, I'm sorry. It's just my nature as a philosophy professor to poke at my students. And everybody that is in front of me that I'm speaking at is a student of mine in my mind. So that's my excuse for being a boor. The other thing is intellectual honesty. Now, I've sat in front of very intelligent men who make arguments about a position that I end up disagreeing with. And so don't let me stand up here just because I'm an American visiting professor and say, oh, well, he thinks that's got to be more persuasive than... No. Intellectual honesty demands that you will weight your position based on what seems most obvious and most essential to you based on everything else that you think you know. Everything else that I think I know and believe about the Bible makes me think that this text has to be read the same way that this text does, and therefore 6,000 years, 6 days of creation, right? So don't give up intellectual honesty in the face of some presenter. It's up to us to weigh the arguments, and this is what we want from our interlocutors in apologetics. We want the atheist to just be open-minded, right? How is he going to be that if we're not open-minded with one another, right? Yeah. But the bottom line is, whatever position you take on the Genesis 1, it clearly does say that there is a creator God, and all of us and all of the universe is his creation. So that puts us in one very specific camp, and the entire rest of the world outside that camp. Those who don't think that Yahweh is the creator God, and those who don't think that there is a creator God, or that we're his creation. So we have more in common than we do not. Okay.
Awesome. Another question. Quick, last question. Going once, going twice, going for 200, 250. I saw that hand. 300. Just teasing. Yeah. Let's go.
I see that hand.
My question, it's not really a question, but my concern this week was that I found out a friend that I hadn't seen in a long time with Bible college, him and his wife, they got divorced and so on, and then getting divorced for the second time, and came to me, and then I sort of just prayed, me and my husband prayed for him because of what he's going through, and then he came back to us and said he's an atheist, and his concern is because he's stuck in Genesis 1, of this creation of 3 days.
Yeah.
I wasn't prepared. You just get a bit of a shock.
Sure.
But I think through all this, the conclusion that I've come out with is that God, I can see it, Him doing, like humans, like doctors that are creating skin and doing this and doing that. It takes time. It takes precise, it takes a long time to do things. I could see Him doing that, for the first day being all that process. But I also see as Jesus, when He did the wine, that He produced the wine.
Sure.
And I mean, the wine is a process.
Yep.
It's got this, and that, and yet He did it instantly.
Yes.
And that's how I see it. That it can be long,
Sure.
and it can be instant.
No, absolutely. The question that divides all of these different Christian positions isn't, I don't think, could God have done it in 6 days 6,000 years ago? I don't think they debate that. The question is, on the balance of the hermeneutical, textual, and scientific evidence, did He do it that way? Or did He do it in some other way? And so you're right to point out that there are instances in Scripture where Jesus does something in an act of creation. What about feeding the 5,000 from 5 loaves and 2 fish? One of my favorite stories. There isn't enough matter, literally, in 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed 5,000 or 10 or 15,000 people, however many it was, with women and children. So there are, and I think Jesus does that to show that He is the Creator God. I think that's why He does that. And so there are aspects of the biblical narrative that show God doing things, creative acts that are instantaneous. So the question isn't, don't understand this to the division to be that God couldn't have done it that way. That's a limit on His omnipotence, right? Of course He could, absolutely. The question is, on the balance of the evidence and our interpretation of the text, is that in fact the way that He did it, right? Young Earth creationists say yes, others say no for whatever reasons. And none of those are sort of calling God into question. The other thing is about your friend turning to atheism is this, that, and this is true for not just him, but many, 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 many people. Very, very, very few people have only intellectual barriers to faith. Most of the time, what we will find when we begin stripping away, all we're doing in apologetics is showing them that this reason that they're hiding behind is wrong. And Francis Schaeffer had this picture of a steeple over their head. They've built a shelter over their head from under which they are hiding from the divine. And what we're doing in our apologetics is peeling those things back so that God can deal with them directly. And a lot of times what people do is, after suffering an emotional hurt, they come up with intellectual reasons to hide behind. Why? Because we don't want to walk around with our wounds exposed. So we cover them up, and a lot of times we cover them up with what sound to us at the time intellectually rigorous reasons, and that protects us from the penetration of the gospel, and so people walk away. Somebody who used to be a disciple of a student of William Lane Craig at Biola came out and wrote a book on how he went to Biola and studied under Craig, and he's an atheist. Yeah, well, what happened, he had an affair with his secretary, and the church that he was in, instead of fostering some reconciliation, kicked him out, and he got mad at the church and became an atheist. Really? Is it really because you don't have, is it really because you discovered all of these rigorous intellectual arguments about Christianity that you never knew existed? No, you got your feelings hurt. And instead of reconciling, doing the right thing and forgiving and doing the hard thing and being healed of your emotional wounds, you just built a shelter, and you call that shelter atheism. So what I appreciate about what you did is that in response to his hurting, you offered what I call to my students just pastoral care. When somebody is hurting, they don't need something for their mind, they need something for their heart. And what they need is the display of Jesus that he has, for example, the woman at the well. He shows her compassion in sitting down and talking with her, asking her for a drink, and then when she feels comfortable with him in this interpersonal way, she asks him her question, and he corrects her wrong thinking. And so sometimes what we need to start with before we get to apologetics so that we can share evangelism is just simple pastoral care. We need to love people, genuinely love them, let them see that we love them and are not judging them, And then when they ask us our question, say you have a friend who's a homosexual, you give them love. You don't ostracize them. Why? Because they're not identified by homosexuality, not in the eyes of God. They're identified by their humanity. Jesus doesn't save homosexuals. He heals men, and he saves men and women who may be acting in that way and can be healed of that if they come to him. So we love them. We invite them to dinner. We invite them to church. We hang out with them. And then when they ask them, what do you think about my lifestyle? Well, let me tell you what God thinks about your lifestyle. Your lifestyle is sin, just like everything you've done is sin. Jesus has paid for that. There's no condemnation in him. Come to Jesus and let the Holy Spirit work you out of this sin. Right? So I appreciate that response of pastoral care, and I want to just commend you for that.
Thanks, guys. Let's give a hand to JT. Thanks for sitting. We went a bit over time. Tomorrow morning we'll make up for it.